Okay, I think we can get started.
Well, hello and welcome. My name is Michael Jan, and I will moderate today's webinar on careers in biotechnology and pharmaceutical medicine for preventive medicine physicians. You'll see a code at the top right of the page that you can scan to go to ACPM's Career Center. If this is not what you tuned in for, I recommend that you stick around anyway, because today's speaker has a wealth of knowledge and experience that might intersect with some portion of your career journey. Today's webinar will kick off ACPM's Career Conversation series, so be on the lookout for more events in the future. Before I speak more about myself and introduce today's speaker, I just want to thank ACPM and everyone who made this event possible. Thank you, Anita, Mira, Cara, Donna, Mirza, Dr. Straus, and thank you for joining us, either live or later on for this recording. You can go to the next slide. So like many of you, I am trained in preventive medicine and came to this field sometime during my MS3 surgery rotation, when I thought that there should be some way to prevent a patient from getting a second below the knee amputation after already having one below the knee amputation. After navigating a crisis of faith through a happy coincidence, a college friend of mine put me in touch with his cousin, who taught biostatistics at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. This cousin happened to be Dr. Ron Brookmeyer, who's now Dean of the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Dr. Brookmeyer heard me out and suggested that my interests might align with what's called a preventive medicine residency. Fast forward 5 years, and I'm sitting in a large lecture hall to learn biostatistics from none other than Dr. Brookmeyer himself. Talk to anyone in preventive medicine, and they'll certainly have an amazing, non-linear story to share. Mine is no different. Talk to any resident in preventive medicine, and they'll have a myriad of ideas of what comes next. For me, quite honestly, I didn't expect to work in the pharmaceutical industry. But during my final year of preventive medicine, I learned about a program jointly sponsored by ACPM and Pharmaceuticals that trained preventive medicine graduates in pharmacovigilance. As an enthusiast of epidemiology and biostatistics, this made total sense to me. We always think about applying prevention at the population level, and this opportunity represented one such population, patients receiving medications. So I applied to the program and have had a positive experience working in pharmacovigilance and patient safety, which I've been doing ever since. I could go on, but I don't want to delay today's webinar. For those who might be wondering, the particular training program with ACPM and OTSCA is paused, but without overcommitting on behalf of ACPM, I know there is interest in creating more such partnerships and opportunities in the future. Next slide, please. So today's webinar will start with a quick introduction of what we do at ACPM, followed by an introduction to pharmaceutical medicine and a discussion of careers in pharma, and a Q&A that I will moderate. This will be a written Q&A, so please type your questions into the Q&A box or chat box in Zoom, and you don't necessarily need to wait in to send your question. You can send them as you think of them. Next slide, please. The American College of Preventive Medicine is a national professional medical society dedicated to the field of preventive medicine, serving more than 2,000 physicians. The college represents and supports these specialists while aiming to advance the field of preventive medicine through robust advocacy, communication, marketing, outreach, and education. Preventive medicine physicians work in a variety of settings, including state and local health departments, Fortune 100 companies, health systems, and all levels of government, as you can see here. Next slide, please. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Walter Straus, who is the Vice President for Clinical Safety and Risk Management at Moderna. After joining Moderna in March 2021, Dr. Straus was charged with building and leading the team responsible for clinical safety and pharmacovigilance for the COVID-19 vaccine program. His current responsibilities include oversight for these areas for the company's vaccine pipeline, and he serves as a departmental sponsor for the application of generative artificial intelligence for pharmacovigilance. Prior to joining Moderna, Dr. Straus was an epidemic intelligence service officer, so the EIS route instead of the PrevMed route. And then he went on staff at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. He then worked for 20 years at Merck & Company, where he led teams in scientific affairs, epidemiology, and clinical safety and risk management, primarily supporting the vaccine and infectious diseases portfolio. His training includes an RDM Baccalaureate from Harvard College, an MD from SUNY Buffalo, internal medicine training at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, an MPH from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and gastroenterology and hepatology fellowships at UNC Chapel Hill. He's contributed to the development and/or post-authorization assessment of numerous small molecules and vaccines, and he's presented and published widely, particularly in drug and vaccine safety, pharmacoepidemiology, and bioethics. He is a former chairman of the Board of Public Responsibility in Medical Research and has served on the executive board of the Harvard Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Program and on the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protection. He is a fellow of the American College of Physicians of Philadelphia and the American College of Physicians. In addition to the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, or CIOMS, working group on artificial intelligence and pharmacovigilance, he has contributed to the CIOMS working groups on drug-induced liver injury and on vaccine safety surveillance. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Straus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jan. And I'll just say that the Zoom backgrounds are always very interesting. So what appears to be a halo around my head is just purely coincidental. So it's really my pleasure to speak with you all today about a field of medicine that I certainly didn't learn about until my career was well underway. And looking back on it now, I consider myself to be a population physician. I've worked in a number of different areas, as Dr. Chen mentioned, but I think the first time I heard the term population physician was by Dr. Hugh Tilson, who totally coincidentally is on the line today. And I think that's very much what I do. And it's what many physicians do in pharmaceutical medicine. And I hope that the next few minutes will provide you with an overview of the sorts of directions in which your career might take should you pursue the pharmaceutical medicine path for yourself. Next slide, please. My disclosures, I'm employed by Moderna, as was mentioned, which is a biotech company involved in mRNA technology. I'm offering my own opinions, not those of my employer. And I'm not going to be discussing any future Moderna products. So there's no real commercial intent or application of the remarks I'll make. Next slide, please. We can start with a definition of pharmaceutical medicine, and you might think of it broadly as a medical discipline, a scientific discipline that focuses on medicines, on vaccines, on medical devices, focusing on their discovery, on development, their evaluation, their registration, which means regulatory issues, monitoring after they are licensed, and communications in order to advance public health and for direct benefit of patients. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we are. You might ask yourself, as a preventive medicine resident, do I have any training that is going to be potentially applicable to working in industry? And I propose that you do. Listed here are a number of different skill sets that are, and in fact, we mentioned generative AI. This was a ChatGPT query. I asked ChatGPT about curricula and preventive medicine residencies, and this popped up, and it looks pretty on target to me. But I think a couple of the areas that are particularly useful for pharmaceutical medicine that you are learning are skills in epidemiology and biostatistics, your work in chronic disease prevention, and in the prevention of infectious diseases, such as through vaccines, work you may undertake in health systems and quality improvement, and then broadly the field of research design, conduct, and analysis. Next slide, please. Why might this career be of interest to you? Next slide. And I'd say that looking back on it, and I've been involved in this field for more than nearly 25 years now. It was going to be a year, but it turned out to be so interesting that I stuck around it's been 25 and it's still interesting. But there are some aspects that I think will be very immediately attractive to you. Firstly, it really is an opportunity to advance human health. And I think that I've actually contributed more to human health working in the pharmaceutical industry than I ever would have had I remained working at the CDC, which is really the standard bearer for public health practice in the US and to some degree internationally as well. You have an opportunity to participate in cutting edge science, as I'll discuss in a bit. You can make a difference on a population level. And you can importantly see research transformed into medical care. One of the aspects that I found challenging working in public health was that we would conduct studies and we go on to the next study, but we didn't really have the ability to pull through our research into application, into seeing that it was transformed. By working within industry where there is a whole commercial arm and a medical affairs arm, which focuses upon trying to make these products available and used in an optimal manner, you do have that pull through. And then an easy aspect as well is working as a team member. In contrast to working in academia, which is in many ways a land of individual entrepreneurs who will work together as teams, but not necessarily. In industry, you have to work as a team. You have to be comfortable working as a team. There are some aspects that are perhaps more difficult. One is that it is a corporate environment. It is the private sector. And I think many people who go into public health are not interested and maybe even somewhat allergic to the concept of working within a private sector environment. And yet, on one level, we all are working for, we're not working for shareholders, we're working for particular governments or state governments. So one's master is working within a corporate setting. It's also a regulated industry, and I didn't really know much about this when I joined Merck initially. And the nature of how you conduct your work is regulated. It's bound in a much more tight manner than is true of working in most academic settings or even most public health settings. I have working as a team member. I didn't mean to include it twice here, but that's a typo. But some may find working as a team member to be more difficult and may find academia to be an academic individualistic approach to be more comfortable. It's also an environment that is somewhat more risky. And by risky, I mean that it's a field that relies upon constant innovation. And there are lots of companies, particularly in biotech, that never make it. And so one has to accept that risk, that individual risk, as an aspect of working in industry. And then, of course, you don't have the opportunity to routinely work in hands-on patient care, although I did that for a number of years on a pro bono basis. Next slide. So here's Dr. Jan's introduction kind of spoiled this, but this is obviously my career. So I'm trained in internal medicine. My original interest was actually a career in international health and international development. And I realized early on that I would have the greatest impact by training in medicine. And I trained in internal medicine with the intent of having public health training after that. Both were at Johns Hopkins for my residency in public health. And then I trained in gastroenterology and hepatology. And coincidentally, at the end of that training, I got to know Dr. Tilson, who's on the line, and who was then at GlaxoSmithKline, and who kind of educated me that one could have a meaningful career working in the private sector, having a research career in the private sector, which had never occurred to me before and which didn't come up in my training. And I've worked in the public health environment at CDC. I've worked with international organizations such as WHO and ministries of health around the world. We can talk about that as well if you like. Next slide. So within industry, I've had I've worked in many different areas. I started off working in what's now called the real world evidence. It was then called outcomes research arena, and worked in a variety of different therapeutic areas. And so this sort of makes the point that you can move around a lot in industry, particularly if you're trained in preventive medicine, where you have skill sets that are applicable to many different areas. I've worked in infectious diseases and vaccines. In fact, that's been what I've spent most of my career working on. Gastroenterology, neurology, rheumatology. I've worked in health economics. I've led teams in epidemiology and medical affairs. We'll talk about medical affairs and scientific affairs more specifically in a bit, as well as clinical safety and pharmacovigilance and risk management. And I have had, I think, a meaningful opportunity to present, to publish, to participate in government committees, professional societies, international initiatives, much as one would in academia or at the CDC for that matter. And I've been involved in fields ranging from bioethics to corporate philanthropy, policy for the company and for other bodies, and artificial intelligence, as has been mentioned. Next slide. So I think many of you might ask the same question that I asked when I was thinking about industry for the first time. And I had this bias, which was that people who worked in industry were not necessarily so talented, and maybe they couldn't quite make it in other fields. Now, if you look at the left-hand figure, you may recognize that. If you could build that first slide out, please. As Louis Pasteur, who is one of the greatest of all scientists. He was spent most of his career based in university setting. He was a founder of the field of microbiology, developed pasteurization, developed vaccines for cholera, for rabies, for anthrax, and others among his accomplishments. But you may not be familiar with the fellow on the right. Could you build that up, please? And that's a photograph of Maurice Hilleman. And Maurice Hilleman's spent most of his career in industry, although he did spend time at Walter Reed as well. And he's responsible for developing more than 40 vaccines. And when he received the Lasker Prize for contributions to public health, it was noted that he may have saved more lives than any scientist in the 20th century. And most of his career, productive career for vaccine development, was spent at Merck and Company in the private sector. Next slide. As an example of the work that one does in the private sector, I'd like to highlight the complementary contributions of not only the private sector, but also how, in some ways uniquely in the US, the government sector, that's the NIH and CDC, the public sector, the academia, and the private sectors all complement one another. So and this is the story of the human papillomavirus vaccine. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Karl Zurhausen, a German oncologist, proposed that cervical cancer was caused by a virus. And this was considered to be a really revolutionary thought for some time and was rejected, as most revolutionary thoughts are. But it led to seminal work in the 1990s by researchers in Australia, Ian Fraser, and research at the NIH, Doug Lowy and Richard Schiller, who elaborated the oncogenesis of cervical cancer and contributed to what became known as the vaccine field of viral-like particles, a novel approach to vaccine development. And starting in the 1990s, Merck and GSK both undertook research and development programs that led to the licensure of 2 HPV vaccines in 2006. Shown on the right is a slide that looks at the prevalence of vaccine types. And you may or may not know that there are a limited number of really bad actor HPV types. 6 and 11 are responsible for genital warts, most genital warts. And 16 and 18 are the dominant oncogenic HPV vaccine types. And what's shown here in the by different ethnicities are changes in the prevalence of these types of HPV in 14 to 19-year-old females in 2013, 2016, compared to the pre-vaccine era. The pre-vaccine era is before 2006. And what you can see, just looking at the say the lower, the far right among Mexican American 14 to 19-year-old females, that the prevalence declined from 10% to 1.3%, an 87% decrease, which is astonishing. You know, the HPV vaccines are arguably one of the greatest of all public health vaccine accomplishments, and an 87% decline in the prevalence of these vaccine types is suggestive that cervical cancer will decline, and we've seen that in a number of countries, and it's Australia, a leading country, and now the U.S. and other countries as well. So an extraordinary accomplishment that would not have been possible without the private sector involvement. Next slide, please. Next piece is that you might wonder, well, where does funding come for biomedical research? And in fact, most biomedical research funding comes from the private sector. Shown on the left, it's a dated slide from 1994 to 2003, but it shows the proportion of funding over time by different sectors. And if you just focus upon the blue and bluish sectors, those highlight that around 65% of all funding in that interval, at the end of that interval in 2003, was from the private sector. That the public sector was responsible for a much lower proportion. In fact, NIH research funding for drug development is dwarfed by private sector investment. Most NIH research is actually skewed to discovery and to early development. And a review of more than 23,000 NIH grants issued in 2000 that led to 18 approved medicines by 2020 showed that of those, the private sector investment was $44.2 billion versus $0.67 billion for the NIH. So the private sector investment is huge and dominant. Next slide. And this is not shown to scale, but it simply makes the point that government and NIH funding for drug and vaccine development is skewed towards discovery and much less to late-stage development, which is actually the much more expensive aspect or phase of development. Next slide. Shown here are areas within pharmaceutical medicine that are particularly relevant for physicians in preventive medicine. And they include quality assurance and control, drug discovery and development. And these are areas that are, these ones are less optimized for preventive medicine than the yellow ones, but we'll mention them. Clinical trials and research, that should be familiar to you. Regulatory affairs, the field of overseeing the development and monitoring of medicinal products. And then drug safety, medical affairs, and market access and health economics. And those areas, I think, are based upon training in preventive medicine, are ones that are a bit easier to access for preventive medicine residents. Next slide. So digging a bit deeper into it, clinical research, physicians involved in clinical research design and conduct clinical trials. You design protocols, you monitor protocols, you evaluate and report findings, and you oversee product development. The field of medical affairs involves largely communications with the medical community to understand questions they may have about the product. So, for example, with the HPV vaccines, an early issue was raising awareness that there was a vaccine, there were vaccines, and that these and highlighting what the research had shown about the benefits of vaccination, and also communicating with OBGYNs, who, if you think about it, are not nearly as well-versed in vaccines as individuals in pediatrics, family medicine, or in internal medicine. And so they serve as an interface between the company and the medical community and play a critical role in communications. Individuals working in epidemiology are involved in characterizing the prevalence of disease targets and the incidence of diseases, and they help inform drug development priorities. So, for example, one of the areas that I worked in was really trying to prioritize what vaccines we should develop, and part of the consideration was understanding the burden of disease. Another aspect was designing clinical trials to help understand drug efficacy and their safety profiles. An example of that was we had a program, a Staphylococcus aureus vaccine program, and the question was, how do you go about identifying populations that are going to be at risk for developing serious staphylococcal infections? It's a clear epidemiologic question. And then post-authorization, after drugs or vaccines are licensed, there are typically studies conducted to evaluate their performance, typically safety, but they also can involve effectiveness. Next slide. A couple of other areas, real-world evidence and health economics. So the real-world evidence uses data sources such as electronic health records, administrative or claims data, and patient registries to understand long-term effectiveness and safety of products. They help shape what's called life cycle management, which means understanding the important questions that occur not only during development, but after a product has been licensed. And they support pricing and reimbursement, which is an issue. It's important in the US, but it's integral to having products used in many countries of the world. And health economics will evaluate cost effectiveness, again, supporting and influencing pricing strategies and market access. Regulatory affairs works as an interface between the companies and regulatory authorities and makes sure that all investigational and marketed products comply with the regulations and laws pertaining to development, registration, and marketing of drugs. Those of you who followed the development of the COVID vaccines, I think, are aware of the constant and intense communication between companies developing these vaccines, regulatory authorities, and other groups, such as convened by the NIH, to assure that these vaccines could be developed as properly and efficiently as possible. It's a clear role for regulatory affairs. Next slide. Okay, now, people wonder about biotechnology, and so-called big pharma. And a couple of features. Generally speaking, biotech is smaller. Some biotech companies have fewer than 100 employees. There's a startup culture where you become the expert. It's often a more informal area. I mean, people at Moderna mostly wear jeans. It's often more, there's often more risk. So it's, these are companies that are often startups, and most of them fail, quite honestly. And they depend upon one or two programs. In comparison, big pharma may have more than 100,000 employees. And because it's so large, it has very specialized skills. So you may find yourself working much more intensely in one area and less, and not necessarily working in as many different areas. And these are generally more financially stable. Clinical development in biotech is more focused on innovation. Big pharma tends to not only focus on innovation, but also they have well-established products which require maintenance and that life cycle management that I mentioned, and they're often global companies. And clinical safety and pharmacovigilance I'll skip that one because I'll come to it in more detail in a minute. I discussed the role of medical affairs. The difference between biotech and big pharma is that medical affairs in biotech may be involved in some clinical trial design and data interpretation. So they may be involved in clinical development as well as in medical affairs and certainly designing studies post-authorization. Whereas post in big pharma, they're much more focused upon strategic communication about a wide range of products to a global audience. And then regulatory affairs, I mentioned the COVID program. In big pharma, they're often, I think the scale leads to somewhat greater complexity because you're managing a wide portfolio of products in a globalized environment. Next slide. Okay, clinical safety and pharmacovigilance. So this is a field that I've spent the last, it's getting close to 10 years working on, and it focuses on the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse events or any other drug-related issues arising in development or after licensure. So these are usually adverse events. They are responsible for the ongoing evaluation of risk-benefit profile of medicines. And in order to maintain the public health and the patient safety after products reach the market, for example, assuring that the labels for products are accurate and that studies are conducted to address any outstanding issues that emerge once a product is licensed. And they monitor data from trials, clinical trials, passive spontaneous reports received following licensure. They monitor the literature, and they use these data to update risk management strategies. Mentioned labels, they conduct ongoing signal investigations to evaluate emergent issues and work across the company to assure that product information is accurate and up to date. Next slide. Here's an example. This is an example drawn from a presentation by Nikki Klein from Kaiser Permanente about not quite a year, well, a few months ago. And what she showed was in the upper slide, the primary series of the COVID vaccines. And in white are like major events. And in yellow are safety topics that emerged. So in April with the Janssen issue concerning cerebrovascular sinus thrombosis. A bit later, the issues related to myocarditis and pericarditis observed with mRNA vaccines. A bit later with Guillain-Barré syndrome and the Janssen vaccine. And then shown in the next panel are safety profile of the monovalent boosters for COVID vaccines. And below that, the bivalent mRNA boosters, and the most recent topic subsequently discounted was the concern around ischemic stroke after one of the bivalent mRNA vaccines. And then at the bottom are a bunch of publications related to investigation of these safety topics. That was work of the VSD, which is coordinated by the CDC and is comprised of a number of major healthcare organizations that contribute data. Next slide, please. So we at Moderna conducted our own review, which was published. And shown here are adverse events of special interest for topics that receive particular attention: anaphylaxis, myocarditis, and TTS and Guillain-Barré syndrome. And what it highlights are reviewing our own data, we were able to demonstrate a slightly elevated risk for myocarditis across all ages. But then we were able to highlight that the risk was greatest for males who were aged 12 to 40 years of age, younger males, and more generally for individuals 12 to 40, and slightly elevated risk for pericarditis overall, but more noted among individuals 12 to 40 years of age. But in contrast, we did not see any evidence in this forest plot for thrombotic thrombocytopenic syndrome or for Guillain-Barré syndrome. So it underscores the point that we do our own research and we publish. Next slide. Okay, So if you're interested, how can you find out more about a career in pharmaceutical medicine? First is literature and publications. So in addition to the major medical journals, which are always publishing research conducted in which the company is a sponsor, there's the Journal Drug Safety, Journal Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, Health Affairs, and there are a lot of other journals as well. There are also professional societies. And ones that I would particularly commend to you are the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, the International Society for Pharmacovigilance. The first is a bit more academic. The second is a bit more practical or occupational. And then the International Society for Pharmaceutical Outcomes Research, which focuses more on real-world evidence and health economics. A number of companies offer internships, summer internships or fellowships for students, and some of these provide a stipend. And then finally, I would build out your training in your residency in the areas listed here, which I alluded to earlier, and take advantage of your training programs. Next slide. And I'll leave you with this. I think it's really, really important to manage your own career. There are mega issues that are transforming all of our lives, such as climate change and population changes. But then there are also a lot of really specific innovations that are going to directly affect medicine and public health in the coming years. mRNA, which is a field that I've been spending the last couple of years working on, CRISPR, cell therapeutics, all the work in the human microbiome, wearable technology like Fitbits and so on, and a lot of these. Applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning, advances in information technologies, increasingly large data sets that allow one to characterize the health of populations, and many more. And I'll leave you with this. Charles Darwin wrote on The Origin of Species that it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I think that's a really good message to leave you with, that it underscores the importance of managing your career, particularly as in a time when medicine and health is changing so rapidly. And I think that's my last slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Straus. Go ahead,
You
please.
can read the summary there, but you have it there.
Oh, no, please. You can finish your own.
But yeah, the key points are that your training in preventive medicine provides you with skills that are really well suited for careers in pharmaceutical medicine, especially clinical safety and pharmacovigilance, but also medical affairs and observational research, such as real-world evidence and epidemiology. And this field of pharmaceutical medicine has been and will continue to be an essential field to advance human health. And it offers the opportunity to be engaged in the development and application of many of the most important medical advances for the future. Thank you. My contact information is there as well.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Straus. And also, should anyone want to get in touch with you directly, please feel free to reach out to myself. I am Cara Molinari, the Director of Medical Education at the American College of Preventive Medicine. And we wanted to thank both you and Dr. Jan for your contributions towards this important topic. I do open the floor and welcome the attendees to type any questions that they might have in the Q&A area. And gentlemen, I will be filtering that, Dr. Jan, to you particularly as the moderator in the chat area, and it will be to the hosts and panelists. I already had put one in there if you had seen that. Okay.
Yes.
Would you like to go ahead and take that? Okay.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dr. Straus. I particularly enjoyed how you were able to touch upon and anticipate some of these questions as well. You really touched upon how a PrevMed skill set would be attractive and applicable to the pharmaceutical industry, also giving some examples of how your training and in epidemiology, biostatistics, what you did in EIS or CDC informed some of the work that you've done in pharma. And if we can actually circle back to that slide with how to find out more about job opportunities, because that was that first question that came in, and I'll read it in case you want to add anything orally to that. And it was, are there any pharmaceutical industry opportunities for practicing physicians? And, certainly people wanting to make that transition, maybe we could speak to that. And also thinking about, you had mentioned maybe you were doing some pro bono work on the side. So I don't know if that question was intended to, can you work in pharma part-time? What would that look like?
Okay, so in terms of the balancing working in industry and working clinically, in my experience, that's kind of tough to do. The issue is, I think many people might have the impression that working in industry is a very easy job in the sense that it has incredibly predictable hours, and and that's not necessarily the case. I worked for the first 5 years or so I was in industry. I worked at doing GI practice pro bono. And then what happened was, as I kind of rose in the organization, I had more and more meetings that I had to attend. And it's like, if you remember The Godfather, I found that I had meetings I couldn't refuse. And so I ultimately had to kind of give it up. I do know there are physicians who manage to carve out usually up to 10% of their time to do pro bono work. But having a career in which you're doing 50-50, I've never really heard of that at all.
And I think that's very fair. I think current president of ACPM, Mirza Rahman, and my one-time boss at Otska, who'd started the program I joined in my training, had always said, even in the interviews, that when he's, advanced in pharma, was working harder than he did in residency at times. So something to keep in mind.
And then I think your other question was finding out about opportunities. Is that right?
Yes.
So there are a couple of ways. Okay, one is, actually, let me take the question about if you're a practicing physician and you want to move into pharma, how do you do it? Well, I mentioned two fields. One was clinical safety and pharmacovigilance, and the other was medical affairs. So I think in my view, those historically are the areas that are easiest for practicing physicians to transition into industry. One area of pharmacovigilance involves medical review. So it involves review of cases, adverse event cases that are reported in. And then your role is to evaluate these medically and then to assign some level of causality to them to determine whether it looks as though these events are coincidental or whether there's confounding, whether there is causality associated with them. And it fundamentally requires medical training. So that's one area that's kind of low-hanging fruit. Another is around medical affairs. And as I mentioned, that's about communication. A lot of the communication is to communication with healthcare practitioners and leaders in fields. And as a physician who understands the programs that have been developed, the products have been licensed by a company, as a physician, you're in a good position to serve as an effective communicator, both bidirectionally. And I don't know, Dr. John, if that's your impression as well, as far as entry into industry from practice.
I definitely think that's spot on. And I do like that you've touched upon not just, I think we've heard a lot about pharmacovigilance at ACPM because it makes a lot of sense with the type of work we do. But I'm glad you were able to share a lot of the other opportunities and avenues where using and leveraging your clinical experience do come in to practice and use. And I think I see some questions about qualifications. So I'll take one of them, and then there's some ethical ones as well. So some great questions coming in. Keep them coming. This one goes, I have noticed most physicians in pharmaceutical medicine usually are board certified, yourself included, in another field. For example, I am. So do you think that these physicians would have an edge over people who are just purely in preventive medicine?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I did not underscore clinical development as an area that's easy to break into is that most individuals working in clinical development, in my experience working, it's been Merck and it's been Moderna, tend to have subspecialty level expertise in those areas. It's not universally true, but that's been my experience. So you need to have like an in-depth understanding of that field. That said, I know of a couple of PhDs without any medical training whatsoever, but who know fields really well and work in clinical development and have achieved senior levels. I think the important part is to have a good foundation in medicine. And so one of the aspects that I find very appealing about preventive medicine is training in epidemiology and biostatistics. I think we are working in a time of big data and being conversant with working with data, with large data sets, and being able to understand understand and interpret data, trial results or results from large observational data sets. I think is a really critical skill set. And frankly, preventive medicine residents have arguably greater training in that than do most physicians trained in, say, internal medicine or pediatrics. So I think that it should not be a hindrance.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And, the second part of that question was noting that, sometimes these physicians, probably in clinical development, don't necessarily have preventive medicine as a drop-down thing. But I think, to your point, speaking about your training and your understanding of these fields of epidemiology, biostatistics can speak to your strengths and make you more marketable. And taking another kind of smaller question in that vein, are there any additional degrees or education post-residency you'd recommend for preventive medicine physicians interested in transitioning into pharmaceutical medicine? And maybe I'll start by saying I think your MPH already gets your foot in the door in addition to your MD. But if you had any other thoughts from what you've seen.
I'd say the MPH is really helpful. And we also are living at a time when of MOOCs, most massive online courses. And so there are programs available through like Coursera, which are many of them are like highly specialized, and so you could. I haven't poked around at this, but I'd argue that you can study anything from macrame to regulatory affairs, and so I think that it would be helpful to spend a bit of time learning about regulatory affairs. Thinking back to public health school, there was a courses on clinical trial design and conduct, and I think that's a useful discipline to understand as well. I did see a question about pharmacology and someone confessing to not having aced their pharmacology class. And I don't think that's a hindrance. There are a lot of different areas in industry, particularly in the bigger companies. And I would argue that that many of my colleagues who work in the area of real world evidence, they have only a passing familiarity with pharmacology. They really, it's just not frankly relevant to what they do. They're working much more in sort of the epidemiology vein. And what they don't know about pharmacology, they can learn from colleagues.
Definitely agree with that, and good for picking out that question. So, yeah, certainly not unless you're on the laboratory side of the development. We're talking more on the side of doing the analysis, looking at the data, interpreting it. So we're not, necessarily going into the weeds and mechanisms of action, but, a higher level understanding of that. And to your point, being able to communicate that with other colleagues, perhaps people in the executive suite who just want to know what the bottom line is. We have to interpret odds ratios and relative risk and what we get from these studies.
Right.
If I could jump into ethics for a moment, there's a question to please elaborate some of the ethical considerations, pressures, and conflicts for working in a for-profit industry. How do we protect ourselves?
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. The first one is when I joined industry, there was a fellow named Harry Guess, who was one of the founders of the field of pharmacoepidemiology. And I asked Harry about this. I actually met him at Chapel Hill when where he taught. He basically taught and he worked at Merck. But Harry said that he doesn't think twice about this supposed conflict of interest because in academia, if you commit research fraud, then you lose your tenure and you may move on to another university. If you commit fraud in industry, you go to jail. And so that's a pretty tight, a pretty strong incentive in and of itself. But frankly, I've often thought that the ethical standards that I have maintained and been expected to maintain are higher than those in academia. It may sound, very counterintuitive, but I really believe that. And it may surprise you to learn that in certainly the two companies that I've worked at, if you poll the employees, you ask them why they're working there, their number one incentive is public health. It's not to generate, massive profits for the company. It's because they want to develop and introduce important new medicines to improve human health. And so I've never felt this concern about conflicts of interest. There are other methods that are used to help reinforce that. For example, the use of data safety monitoring boards for clinical trials, which provide independent oversight. We typically have expert consultants who provide guidance to us on outstanding research questions, such as how do you go about developing a vaccine, or what do you think the appropriate population would be for this drug? So there are a number of checks and balances in place, and I personally have been able to build upon this commitment to research ethics through a number of external activities, including professional society involvement, where I was the chair of public responsibility in medicine and research, and I've served on Health and Human Service Committee on Human Research Protection. So I really think there is that concern is exaggerated. The one point I would make, though, is that much like there is a large variability in universities, and you can choose your favorite university and choose one that you think is disgraceful. There is also a large variability among companies. And if you pursue this career, I think it's good to go in with your eyes open and really understand what their programs are, not only whether the topics are of interest, but also how they've been conducted, and whether companies that have that are reliant upon one product only, it's in early development, it's a more uncomfortable setting to be in than one company that has a large portfolio in some ways.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we have time. I think I can squeeze in just one kind of hybrid question here, specific to pharmacovigilance. So let's see. One is the American Society of Pharmacovigilance Physicians membership recommended? And then also, conferences in pharmacovigilance, which is the best one? There are a lot that are out there. Are there any particularly for someone in residency to learn more about?
I'm sorry, Dr. Jan, can you repeat that? I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, of course. So conferences for pharmacovigilance, are there any
Yeah.
you would recommend? I know there are a lot
Yes.
that are out there.
Yes. So two that I would recommend particularly are the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, which holds an annual conference, and it alternates between the U.S. and typically the U.S. and Europe every year. And that is a conference that brings together academics working in pharmacoepidemiology and researchers working in industry and some government as well. So that's one area that I think is really pertinent. Another one is this International Society of Pharmacovigilance. This is much more about the practice of pharmacovigilance. And so those would be two that would be of keen interest.
Excellent. And
I'll mention these four as well.
I'm sorry.
International Society for International Society for Pharmaceutical Outcomes Research. So that's deals with real world evidence, health economics, and so on.
Just to add, interestingly enough, the ACPM is in a joint providership with the American Society of Pharmacovigilance currently. So we furnish them with the CMA. I just produced several certificates today. So that's an example of our partnership as well.
Can I mention just one more thing? It's a question about recruiters, okay? So you can easily identify recruiters, and their job is they're headhunters. Their job is to find bodies and position them, okay, with companies. And this is that Darwinian concept I suggested. So recognize that's their role. They play an important role, but their number one interest is to get physicians and staff into companies. So, use your discretion in working with them. I found some are very good and some are somewhat less so. But that is clearly an opportunity.
Wonderful. And if there are any questions we missed, we'll review the Q&A and we can get in touch with who would need those answers. I just want to hand it over and thank you again, Dr. Straus, for an amazing talk and taking time for these questions. I'll hand it over now to Cara Molinari to take us home.
Okay, thank you so much again, Drs. Jan and Straus. Please be sure to join ACPM, the special interest groups. There will be one on global health led by Dr. Jan, who welcomed us today, and pharmacovigilance led by Dr. Leah Kostyuk and Dr. Leila Ojeda. You can see the more information for there's the hyperlink that is included right now in the chat. Also, the special interest groups will have an opportunity to meet at PM24 itself. If you register by January 30th, which is just in about a week or so, take advantage of the early bird rates before they go up in just a week or so. And please see the hyperlink here. And please join us tomorrow for our advocacy training webinar. You can scan the QR code to the right. I also included a reminder to please go to ACPM's YouTube channel in order to access today's recording as brought to you by both Drs. Straus and Jan and ACPM. With that, I believe we are finished.
Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you all both.